Thank you everyone for joining us, albeit virtually, for our discussion today with some incredible panelists who I will introduce here shortly. I'm Preston Dunlap, Founding Chief Architect Officer of the Department of the Air Force and Space Force. My organization was established to posture our two services to not only invest in the right mix of capabilities, but to do so with agility, speed, and integration of those capabilities built in from the beginning. We may have to budget in stovepipes, but we certainly always operate as a team. And so over the past 2 years since our office was established, we've seen tremendous strides towards not only building adaptable systems, but building systems adaptively. From next generation or dominance to adoption of commercial practices, such as building capabilities with digital engineering and open architecture, DevSecOps software design and deployment, as well as joint all-domain command and control and the Advanced Battle Management System, or ABMS, which are the focuses of today's conversation. Today's discussion is intended to be interactive, meaning you have the chance to actually change the course of this very conversation in real time. Well, how would you do that? Well, that's by actually submitting your questions via the Q&A window. That's the Q&A window, not the chat window below. So click on Q&A. There was such interest, we actually received a number of questions ahead of time. However, my intention is to prioritize those questions that you asked to us right here live. So go ahead and start, click on Q&A and begin by asking your questions, and we'll get to that after the panelists have had their opening remarks. Before we do so, let's go ahead and set the context for that discussion. A few thoughts. The modern battlefield is expansive, both in terms of domains that you can see and domains that you can't see. Boundary lines that have been drawn on a map that we call areas of responsibility translate into gaps and seams that can be exploited by potential adversaries. Geographies are too expansive, targets even too fleeting, and areas too denied for any single platform to be able to do it all. Therefore, there's a national security imperative to bring capabilities together into a digital network that's supercharged with data and information that they need to achieve the objectives they've been called upon to do. In other words, you not only need the right ingredients, but you have to have the best recipe. We've got capabilities, but we must bring them together to be able to achieve the operational effects that we must be able to perform. As we look back, we've accomplished a tremendous number of technical firsts here for the Department of the Space Force and Air Force, and even really for all of DoD, because of the tremendous partnerships with folks like our panelists today, a broad innovation base from longstanding partners to new entrants and small firms, where we've seen things like providing cloud-based data and artificial intelligence to operators on the very forward edges of the COVID-19 fight when the nation experienced that a year ago for the first time. To making platforms like our 5th generation fighters and advanced capabilities talk to each other in their native languages in a way they haven't before and with other assets. To bring the power of an intelligence exploitation center or an operations center right in the palm of your hand with zero trust tablets and devices connected to classified networks over new connectivity pathways like 5G to cloud-based AI-enabled real-time data management that have taken kill chains from minutes down to seconds. All of these and other JADC2 and ABMS successes have shown us as a department with these great partnerships from industry that we can, as a military, actually build an Internet of Things that's relevant and operationally productive. And this resulted in our decision this past year and this past Thanksgiving even to declare ABMS as an acquisition program of record and assign a program executive office that cuts across both of our services to oversee the delivery, fielding, and sustainment of those capabilities. Well, we must continue the creative innovation and driving and delivering capabilities quickly in partnership with industry, while we also field and sustain slices of capabilities over time to be able to achieve the needed capabilities that our warfighter requires. And so this we're going to turn then to the focus of the rest of the conversation, our distinguished panelists here, that represent a number of companies that have contributed to these JADC2 successes and others over the past year. Joining me today, I've got John Rhone, who's the Director of Command and Control and ABMS for SAIC. Braxton Rehm, Director of JADC2 for Collins Aerospace. We've got Lance Spencer, Client Executive Vice President for AT&T Public Sector. Brad Reeves, Director of C4ISR from Elbit Systems. Each of you has served our country in uniform, and I thank you for that. And now you are serving those in uniform now once again by providing critical capabilities that our nation needs. And so I'd like to start out by giving each of you up to 5 minutes to be able to discuss your unique perspectives, having both served and now providing capabilities on the need, the challenges, the opportunities for JADC2 and ABMS capabilities. So with that, I'm going to start, if we could, John, with you, and then I'll go to Braxton, Lance, and Brad. So John Rhone, over to you.
Thank you, Preston. It's an honor to be here and share the virtual stage with these gentlemen. In 2016, 2017, I was the Director of Combat Operations at AFCENT. And in the AOC, my responsibility was on behalf of the CFAC, was to run the operations in the war. I remember every time that we had to get information from a different domain other than the air domain, space or cyber in particular, walking, not an exaggeration, probably 200 yards through a couple of different windows, through some vaults, back to a stow cell with a sticky pad, and writing down information that we got from either space or writing down information we have for cyber, walking not so quickly back to the ops floor, maybe stopping at the bathroom or something like that, grab a coffee, and then using that information on that sticky pad and trying to integrate that and to make decisions for an operation that is going on. And these operations were from the mundane all the way up to discussions about rescuing Americans from places that we wanted to get them from, to making sure that we've deconflicted and are dropping bombs or hitting the right target with either kinetic weapons or non-kinetic weapons. So what I took from that was, with all these big brains and all the smart people that we have, that integrating the domains is not really a technical challenge. It's an integration challenge that we have. We will win or lose the next wars because we have made the right decisions faster, more efficiently, and more effectively than the adversaries. If we win those and we integrate the domains, we will be successful. If we don't integrate the domains and we have to continue doing what we've been doing, what I described that happened only 4 short years ago, then we're going to lose. All domain, join all domain, combine, join all domain command and control is ultimately about decision making. Everything that we do, the architecture that's built, the platforms, the sensors, the data, it's all to help a decision maker, whether that individual is at the edge in his or her cockpit, on an AWACS, in a CRC, at an op center. It's designed to help them make decisions faster, make the right decisions at the right time, and to present that data-derived information in such a manner that's digestible to the individual, that they can make that. Now, of course, there's all things to consider: AI enhancements, how it's formatted. Can you get an immersive type of experience? But presenting that data is going to be key. Understanding how to use that data, what it's going to look like, is also going to be key. Places like Preston, I know you're familiar with the Shadow Ops Center in Nellis, which I view as the Air Force's, potentially Air Force's JADC2 battle lab that's integrating the joint staff plus each of the services' JADC2 efforts. It gives warfighters the opportunity to actually feel what the data looks like, feel what the information and the decisions look like, and then have input to change that. So integrating all the exquisite systems and the platforms, both legacy platforms and the emerging platforms, is going to be key. So I'm excited to be part of an SAIC team that is singularly focused on how to integrate all of the platforms, all of the sensors, and all of the other eaches that the other OEMs and the other product deliverers provide. So thanks again for the time, and I'll turn it over to the gentlemen that are a lot smarter than I am now. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John, so much. I appreciate those comments. Braxton, over to you.
Well, good evening or afternoon for everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to be talking with our airmen and our guardians and talking about something near and dear to my heart, which is JADC2. As I left the service, I was able to spend my last 3 years in the Pentagon and working on several of the background issues, such as how do we do ISR better as a country and as a nation, How do we enable our remotely piloted aircraft and integrate that with our C4ISR enterprise? So that experience of doing that really comes full circle now in my current job here with Collins. And I've had the opportunity to work with talk with just about every one of the panelists here in the last 2 years of my experience on the industry side. Going back to kind of tie the knot of where Big Dog was in my career, I started off my career doing maintenance and logistics and transition to the F-16. And that was early enough in the evolution of the F-16 to where I did not have any connective tissue or connectivity outside of radios to any other players, not even my wingmen. So I'm old enough to fly the Block 30 and employ that in combat, but I didn't have Link 16. We didn't have interconnected tissues for data links. We didn't have an ability to talk through our space platforms like we do now on some of those platforms as they've gotten more mature in technology. Then I moved on to fly RPAs, where I flew the MQ-1, MQ-9, and now I'm flying a kludged together platform at that time in the early beginnings in a theater halfway around the world, where I'm sitting in Nellis and Creech flying that, but I'm connected through all domains. So I'm using space assets, I'm using cyber assets, I'm talking to and working with ground assets through RF communications, and we're teamed up to try to get an effect on the battlefield. And so from that experience of seeing where I started from in my career to where I ended up flying remotely piloted aircraft, some on the highly classified side, such as the RQ-170, where I was a commander of, I got to see how not only challenging connecting those it is going to be to connect all those domains together, but the limitations of doing that. But inside of that, there's a great opportunity to make things work really well. We've gone through years and years of training to do the coin fight that we've been in for the last almost 30 years now. And I see that as we move forward in the JADC2 ABMS effort, the cultural change back to some of the abilities that we used to think about of not having to ask for permission or connect into other people are going to be asked to be articulated through our ROE and spins as well to enable the JADC2 ABMS capabilities. But additionally, because we are connected, we have an opportunity to share so much more data on the forward edge of the battlefield with many more partners than we used to. That's going to create an opportunity for us that Preston mentioned earlier in his opening that we can do. Technology is not going to be the problem. It's going to be a cultural change. It's going to be a procedural change. And it's going to be a process change that we're going to have to work through in order to enable JADC2. We have industry partnerships across the board here with all the panelists and their companies and many others. We can get this problem solved. It's going to be a challenge moving forward to make sure that we can do that and make sure that we're also advising on how we do change those attitudes, we do change those policies with confidence in the technologies that we produce.
Great, thanks so much for those comments. Lance, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Preston, and appreciate you having me and our compadres here on the call together to discuss this today. I'm going to focus on 3 big takeaways. The first is, I encourage the Air Force and Space Force to use commercial capabilities that have already been developed and delivered within the private sector as much as possible. That allows the Air Force and Space Force to focus capital and investment on problems that are squarely in the Air Force, Space Force job jar, and then leverage commercial investment for problems that are the private sectors to solve. There's integration challenges and some other things that I'm sure we'll have to work through. But not duplicating effort and investment, I think, will help stretch dollars and the work across the board further and get better benefit across the board. An example is, over the past 5 years, AT&T has invested more than $110 billion into our wired and wireless networks. That's a ton of money and a ton of capability that's on the table that could be taken advantage of for military operations and missions. In previous events, General Goldfein used to mention in his priorities that he wanted to connect the force with a global sensing network. Much of that exists today. The challenge is, how does the Air Force and Space Force take advantage of that? Our AT&T global wired and wireless network is a great example of a robust, reliable, and resilient network that can provide a lot of benefit. And of course, it's going to need extensions and augmentation. And we have partners, including the teammates here on the call, that we can work with. But it's a way to allow the Air Force and Space Force to avoid spending billions of dollars trying to replicate something that already exists. You know, as you're aware, Preston, one of the things we demonstrated in the ABMS on-ramp 2 was how to take advantage of commercial 5G for joint force operations. And so we brought commercial 5G, FirstNet, cells on wheels and flying cells on wings to that on-ramp to show that it could be incorporated into the capability and tool set. And that could be scaled and used globally, including things like deployed commercial capabilities. The second, I think, key takeaway is make it easy for commercial providers to deliver capabilities to the force. And the FAR is great. You know, I'm not saying it's not, but so are commercial terms and conditions. And one of the things I've learned being on both sides of this now is that most commercial capabilities, they're very robust. They've been tested across the Fortune companies who have very similar concerns as the Air Force and Space Force, like cybersecurity, IP, and data rights, but they're productized to commercial terms and conditions. So having to adapt them to the FAR requires customization, which creates expense and creates complexity and interoperability problems. So if there's ways to embrace commercial terms and conditions as much as possible, then I think that will help better integration and interoperability, and again, get better value out of commercial capabilities that are available as we apply them to Air Force and Space Force operations. The third key takeaway, I think, is partnerships and alliances matter. You know, everybody on this call is an example of that. Everybody participating in the virtual AWS is an example of that. You know, it's both within government and across the private sector. Public sector partnerships are a great example of the way to bring skin to the game and bring them together. When I say that, I mean public-private partnerships, which is a great tool in the arsenal that the Air Force and Space Force can take advantage of. You know, an example that I'm very familiar with is FirstNet, which is the National Public Safety Broadband Network under the Department of Commerce, which was a great way where AT&T and the government could bring equity and investment together under a public-private partnership construct to bring capabilities that were specifically tuned to those kinds of mission needs that emergency and first responders need for broadband networks. And, you know, I mentioned investment. You know, there's several of us representing our companies and capabilities up here, but there's so many others, and we all invest together. I mean, when AT&T, when we say we've invested $110 billion in the last 5 years, that's more investment in the United States than any other company. But we're investing together, and so many companies across the board come together behind the scenes and figure out how to make prudent investment decisions that the Air Force and Space Force can take advantage of, which I guess goes back to my first point. And then just kind of to wrap up, you know, Dr. Roper used to talk about looking to the Century Series for lessons on how to innovate and win as a nation, and how to go through taking risk and experimenting and then moving forward based off of the lessons learned. And I think that's a great idea. And I think there's a lot to be learned from history and heritage. You know, during World War II, the head of Bell Labs was what we'd call today the DoD Chief Technology Officer, bringing that private sector capability to the war effort in World War II. You know, you don't always see our name on some of the kind of capabilities that we may be talking about, but we've been supporting DoD for over 100 years. The first command and control network, the General Pershing used in World War I, was run by AT&T on the front lines. We ran the Strategic Automated Command and Control System, SAICs, back in the day. And there's all kinds of opportunity for bringing commercial prototypes and innovation for adoption to military use cases. So I hope that gives some good considerations to think about as we're charting our way ahead in strategy together. And thank you again for including me on the panel.
Thanks, Lance. Appreciate those comments. Brad, over to you.
Okay, well, let's start with a fun fact since we're talking JADC2 today. First, did you know that this day in history, exactly 30 years ago, the US launched a ground invasion of Iraq? But this was only possible after 6 weeks of intensive bombing by US and coalition air power. And so that is rightfully so a proud part of our Air Force history. After all, it was extremely successful. But I think we all know that 6 weeks of an air campaign followed by a ground campaign is not the best model for joint all-domain operations. We have better examples in history, and hopefully you're interested to hear those, because I'm going to give you what I believe is the best example. So I'll tell you that. But first, I do want to say thank you, Mr. Dunlap, for moderating today. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm honored to be among such a distinguished panel of great Americans determined to make an impactful difference for you, our warfighters. But at the same time, I'm also encouraged. That's because I know that the ingredients are in place to achieve a true JADC2 capability, one that evolves from the old Desert Storm ways of war that deconflicted forces, but did not truly integrate them. That's kind of to Big Dog's point earlier, to John's. So let's talk about some of the friction points that still exist today. If you're part of our Space Forces and you've been frustrated by green doors and struggling to get capability pushed out in real time to the tactical warfighters, then I'm telling you that there is hope. If you're a fighter pilot and you're wondering why you have to play the telephone game to pass data to joint players, then there is hope. And for our tactical C2 teams that are frustrated with the swivel chair tactics, there is also hope. But I also do want to acknowledge that this is a daunting task. And after all, we spent the last 2 decades structuring our force for counterterrorism, and it takes some time to pivot to a force that's postured for a peer competitor in a highly contested environment. So I get it. I've been there. I feel your frustration when you're manually transferring information from one C2 system via JChat, so someone on the other end can then manually enter it into their C2 system. I understand the frustration of our mission commanders who spend more time working a tanker deconfliction plan or a comm card than they do on developing the tactics. So if you're a battlefield airman responsible for air-land integration, but may not have a JARM to achieve basic connectivity, I'm with you. It is frustrating. I do understand that. So no doubt you're dealing with real issues that impact the mission. But now let's pick back up where we left off. So let me tell you a story about the best example of joint C2. It's a time in our history where we nailed it. But the reason is different than what you might expect. It wasn't the technology that made the difference, though I am a big fan of high tech. The reasons we were successful were due to 3 preconditions that were in place at the time, and they've come back around to today, which I find very intriguing. The first is clear competitor, so they knew who the competition was. The second was there was cross-service cooperation, and then finally there was strong industry support. That goes to Lance's point that he was just making. So here's what happened. Pete Quesada, he's an Air Force general officer. He's in charge of all the tactical fighters in Western Europe. And Army General Officer Omar Bradley. During World War II, they built the most powerful air-land team to have ever existed up to that point, in spite of being products of bitter service rivalry. So how did they do it? Well, they were determined to work together. They were an inseparable team. In fact, their tents even traveled side by side as they advanced east along the battlefront. And so like today, they also face daunting challenges when it comes to joint integration. And these will be no stranger to you. They dealt with stovepipe organizations, for example, but they were able to do the seemingly impossible at the time. They integrated the Army and the Air Corps in a way that was central to the success that started in Normandy and gained momentum all the way through what is arguably the most significant yet least recognized battle in World War II, and that's the Battle of Mortaine. Now, there are more instructive parallels to what we're doing today. Quesada and Bradley shortened the F2T2 EA kill chain by integrating sensors and shooters. They took the P-47 Mach 1 pilot eyeball, they integrated that with Sherman tanks and artillery. They accomplished high levels of connectivity by adding Air Force radios and tanks for joint operations. They focused effects integration by harnessing the firepower of both fighters and surface fires in collaborative attacks, and developed innovative tactics like armored column cover. So they increased the speed of decision-making as well by placing planning teams together for rapid data processing while pushing decision-making to the lowest levels. And for the young guys out in the audience, guys and gals, that probably sounds pretty good, right? In other words, they created a joint C2 asymmetric advantage that overwhelmed the Axis. This should be encouraging for us, because if they could do all that with good old-fashioned NI, natural intelligence, imagine what we can do with AI, with artificial intelligence. So here's where we need to pay attention today. The first ingredient for success is knowing the threat. Thanks to our national defense strategy, we now have crystal clarity on that. In fact, we share the top competitive theaters today that they did back then in World War II, Indo-PACOM and EUCOM. As a matter of fact, it's fascinating how history can inform the future. So now let's get into what is the most important part of that success, and that was the strong service relationships. The dogged determination of Quesada and Bradley to build a strong relationship is unfolding today in our Chief of Staff, General Brown, along with Army's Chief of Staff, General McConville. And so there is hope there. Now, the final ingredient for success in World War II was the partnership between defense and industry. So I want you to be encouraged that you have partners in industry like Lance, like John, Big Dog and NASA, as I know them, that are fighting for you today. And so we as industry, we are engaged and we're eager to deliver JADC2 capability. So there is hope. The 3 active ingredients, they're all here and ready and set up for success. So here's what I would ask of you, the audience today. Let us know what's on your mind. Let us know how we in industry can serve you, how we can partner with you. We want to know what frustrates you, what you struggle with, and what you wish were possible. So I'm proud to be a part of this and know that there is hope. And so now let's arise, go forth and conquer.
Brad, excellent. Thanks for rounding us out there in the opening remarks. And why don't we just actually start basically where you ended, but in reverse. So one of the questions that I got was, how can the Air Force and the Space Force better partner with industry and enable industry to be able to meet this JADC2 and ABMS capabilities that are required? So that was not directed at any particular panelist, so open to anyone who wants to answer.
I'll start, Preston, and I think it's pretty simple. It's be very forthcoming with your requirements, the gaps in your requirements, and a timeline. I think all of us work with people who, given enough time, can solve any problem. But I think one of the things that you've been pushing for, Preston, and I know that the Joint Staff is pushing for, is speed to ramp, for lack of a better word. What do you need right now? And what can we iterate to get better later, as opposed to waiting for the 80 or 90% solution? Let us give you the 30 or 40% solution, get it in the hands of the smart NCOs and CGOs, and let them figure it out, and then we'll iterate from there. Over.
I'll add to that I think it starts with trust. And I get protecting and committing government and all that kind of stuff. I've been in those shoes myself. But trust the players that are trying to contribute, and then bring us in and let us help solve the problems. There's innovation and capabilities that sometimes don't always meet what might be envisioned as trying to come up with a PWS or TRD, work statement or a requirements document. Help us come up with ways to collaboratively work together and flexibly solve problems, but it starts with trust.
Yeah, I think great comments. I certainly agree. I would just commend what I've seen happening over, maybe the last year or so, or year and a half in the ABMS history. And that is where there's been this, I see a paradigm shift where, as opposed to the DoD putting out a very, very specific list of requirements, they've kind of come to industry and asked industry to help them define those requirements and help them define the problem and get after the solution based on what industry has to offer, including the both commercial and on the defense side. So I think that has really made a big difference. Probably the next step is that in the partnering of that is to make sure that we're able to really engage, and it takes some time and effort to build the relationship like in anywhere else. And so it's the time that we can actually engage with the right players in the Air Force to sit down, whether it's with the operators, with the PMs, with the Air Force engineers on the air and space side, and sit down with them and do a little bit of brainstorming and understand what the problem is. Most importantly, in industry, we desperately want to make sure that we understand what the problem is, because the last thing we want to do is come up with this really cool solution that solves a problem that doesn't exist, right? And so that would be kind of my put towards that. But I really think that I just want to commend you and the efforts when Dr. Roper was leading there and all. I mean, I think there's been some phenomenal shifts in a very positive way. And I just want to say thank you for those.
I think I'll jump in here and add just a little bit of different color. I think the comments made by my teammates here are very accurate. One area that I think that our airmen and our guardians can do to help us out as industry is realize the challenges that we have in building technology to meet those requirements in your problem set. Whether we do that through on-ramps like Preston talked with the ABMS, or JADC2 integrated exercises that are happening in Indo-PACOM or in the CONUS or anywhere else in the world, I think that in order for industry to be a team player, which most every one of the people that I know in industry wants to be a team member and a player and support our warfighters holistically, especially those of us that came out of that background. But even the teams that aren't from that same cloth do want to be a partner with our DoD. They understand the importance is to have access. And so I think access to some of those complicated, challenging, classified problem sets that you have, so that we can design and build technology to meet that threat, is important. And access is much more difficult on the industry side than it used to be on the DoD side. And those of us who know, access in the security and classified realm on the DoD side is hard any day of the week. It's twice as hard or 3 times as hard on the industry side. So having that access to be able to understand your problem set is important. And secondly, I would tie that into an acquisition strategy, kind of Big Dog pointed out to. Not only do we need to know what you're trying to get at, and yes, there's certainly a place for demonstration of emerging technologies on on-ramps and exercises. We want to do that as well too. But we need to have a clear, then how do we transition that to an acquisition program? Because in industry, we have to go out and identify a market. We can't just invest because we want to. That would be nice, but we need to understand how we're going to make that something that industry then can play in and how we can compete in, so that when we do go to market, we can understand where we can partner with our teammates in industry, or partner with our DoD enterprises and FDRCs if we need to, those labs, so that we can get at this technology problem set.
Great, thanks. I appreciate each of you touching on that. One question that I've actually I'm getting a lot of here, which is the question of, given a lot of modern technology that's available and the ability to do new things with new platforms is one thing, but we have a large number of often called legacy, but let's call it current capabilities that exist that aren't necessarily readily integratable with the system that each of you are speaking of. So how do you see either within your own companies and the capabilities that you're delivering, and envision being able to bring in current capabilities into a modern network, or for those of you who don't or aren't in that situation, what are your suggestions to be able to bring current capabilities into the JADC2 network?
Preston, I love that question. And my background as an air battle manager, growing up in the C2 world, and I think unabashedly ashamed that I feel like a lot of the capabilities that we provide are the legacy. Are current, but current as in 1970s, 1980s. So specifically from SAIC's perspective, SAIC is tool system platform agnostic. We truly believe that integrating all the capabilities you talked about, bridging the current capabilities with the 5th, even 6th and further generations is going to be key. We will not go fight a war that is solely consisting of F-35s or that is solely consisting of B-21s. Somebody is going to have to, at different levels, command and control that, battle manage that. And until we come up with something different, the current systems are going to be the platforms and the people that are doing that. There will be aluminum aircraft mixed with low observable aircraft. There will be tankers that are around. So how do we work on that? I think digital engineering, the secretary, the chief, have all talked about the importance of digital engineering. And figuring out how the system of systems is going to work, understanding the trade space, I think is what digital engineering brings. And from an SAIC perspective, it's tool agnostic, and continuing to hire the right people and develop the right technologies to bring that capability as a risk prediction, help with source selection, and essentially optimize the enterprise. Over.
Yeah, I'll add to that.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So I think standards are important, and being able to use open standards, open radio access networks, open orchestration, many of the open platforms, I think is a key way to how to move forward. I think that there's some misunderstandings about open, and there's perceived security risks when actually there's an amazing amount of scrutiny and rigor behind open standards. Open does not mean insecure, but I think it's perceived that way sometimes. Open standards is how the world operates, and commercial standards is how the world operates. And taking advantage of the best of what's out there that's been innovated and delivered, I think is the starting point. And granted, there's additional military requirements that are on top of that. Whether you're thinking about contested environments, airborne operations, hardening, things like that. Some of those do crosswalk pretty well. Some are fairly unique. And so rather than starting from the ground up with unique standards that force legacy and force huge investment to overcome, instead leverage the commercial standards as much as possible, and then augment where necessary with where it needs to be augmented or extended beyond where commercial can take it.
Yeah, I do. I think the standards are definitely important. So kind of the approach we've taken at Elbit America is we understand, we're designing all the stuff we design today. The standards can absolutely be baked into the future things that we're building. But the problem, of course, is how do you bridge that gap? I think that's where the question was coming from with these, as you call them, current systems. So what we're doing is we have we call it adapters, but we basically are building an open architecture framework and standards. We're using adapters to adapt the stuff that's current. And really, this is no different, right? Than when the Internet of Things came along, you didn't have smart thermoses and smart lights in your house, but you could buy a device and plug that device connect it to a thermos, for example, and then you could control that from your iPhone with an app, right? Today, that's already built in. You don't have to have an adapter to do that. But that's kind of that's a way we view this, is you have adapters for things that are current. And then, of course, you have the standards for the new stuff. Now, if I can, I'll go back to the previous question, because I think this is also a good point when it comes to the partnering between the services and industry. So Platform One, for example, obviously that's a big push right now on the ABMS side. And so there's a lot of standards and all that are coming out with those. Those things we in industry need to know, what are those standards? What are you seeing on the services side that you want to make standards so that we can then design that and bake that into what we're working on? And so I think that's a good opportunity for partnering there as well. Thank you.
Well, I think that from the Collins Aerospace perspective, the legacy 4th gen existing platforms probably creates one of the largest problem sets that we have to deal with. But there's, like I've kind of mentioned before, there's opportunity inside of that. Just like Riva and Big Dog and Lance have pointed out, those systems are not going to be replaced, and we're not going to be able to upgrade them as fast or as easy as we'd like to. So within inside of that, at Collins, we're working on adaptive gateway solutions that can connect different players on the battlefield like they've never been connected before. And an example of that, is gateways on tankers or gateways on bombers, and integrating that out with our new emerging space capabilities there at the Space Force through the SDA initiatives. It's how do we build that infrastructure and include existing platforms in that? It's going to take some adaptability. Open standards and the rule sets behind those are absolutely going to be a player. But it's also realizing that changing all those to something that's going to be integrated is going to take some effort. And there's probably going to be a lot of different solutions that we need to look to. But we also have to work as industry and a DoD partnership to get at that problem set, define it clearly, and then understand a roadmap to where we're going to go. And I think we'll see some of that help come about as the J6 is producing a strategy for JADC2 to General Milley for approval. And I think that will also provide some clarity of how we do that across the Joint Force as well, not just the Air Force and the Space Force. We have to be integrated across the Joint Force to do that. Now you're really talking about bringing in a lot of legacy platforms when you start bringing in the whole Joint Force. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion, in my opinion. And it's going to take all of us in industry and DoD to kind of get to the place where we can understand that the movement of the data around, not necessarily the system that is currently on, is going to be the important thing. And how do we enable that data to be moved around in the best and most efficient way?
Great, thanks. Yeah, one question that I think each of you has a unique perspective on that I've got is that there's a natural sort of tension between the creativity, innovation of technology and capabilities, and then the operational concepts and tactics to employ them. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So you want to refine requirements in an objective mission space, so you build to that. On the other hand, maybe the technology has something that the operators may not be able to think about. We've been able to see this sort of firsthand over the last year as operators and technologists and companies roll up their sleeves to be able to do these sort of joint flag-like exercises we call on-ramps to be able to mature operational concepts and technology next to each other. The question is, for each of you having both sides of the coin in your experience, how do you push both operational concepts to mature and be creative? So we have legacy tactical command and control concepts and tactics that both services use, and yet technology is sort of enabling that to be busted open, and then the operational imperative to not rely on very sort of vulnerable platforms either in the sky or in space or on the ground, and so that the tie between moving ConOps forward while moving technology forward. Open to the panel.
So Preston, I think you and I don't know if you remember, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, we talked about this. I think that the challenge is, one, when you get the operators and the developers together, one part of the team that used to be missing, and maybe they're in there now, you just don't know, are the acquirers. When you sit down with the developers and you sit down with the operators, and then the acquirers understand that we may have to do things a little bit differently to get this capability to the operators, to get them to understand that it's going to change and we don't quite know what the requirements are, and to be okay not knowing what the requirements are going to develop. I think that is key. And then in addition to that, when the operators sit down with the acquirers and they sit down with the developers, they have to be able to have some way of updating and getting their concepts or their TTPs back out there on the floor so they can try them again and iterate and reiterate and figure out that didn't work, and not think of that as a failure or wasted effort or wasted time, but that's just the way we do business from here on out as we start to develop things faster and get the technology out so the operators can develop those TTPs and then go back to the developers and back to the acquirers. And I just don't know that our system, the Air Force system, is optimized for that kind of speed and those kind of iterations. Over.
Yeah, I'd be glad to jump in here a little bit and provide a little thought that's similar to what Big Dog just said. One of the things, having lived on both sides of the coin, that I see is that we usually, in the DoD side, when I was in uniform and all of us were, we developed TTPs after we got all the technologies, and it was evolving. It never really happened as the technology was evolving, and technology inserts were not looked at as something that could be modified or changed to then provide an opportunity for our operators across the board to take a look at and provide input into, similar to what Big Dog was talking about. For example, Collins right now is fielding for the Navy TIX-2 and for the Air Force P-6, which is an advanced ACMI platform. It's got a lot of multi-level security, cross-domain guard solutions in it, but it's tied into a ground network. And what we've articulated is ability to don't think of that just as a test and training or an exercise capability. Think of it as an opportunity to insert different operational waveforms and start chipping away and building TTPs as we discover how we could use this technology better while we're in the process of building what may be the fundamental backbone that exists, in the next 10 to 15 years. So I would say that linkages between fielding of current and existing and emerging technologies with an open mindset and integration with our warfighters to have input into that as a build out to solve problems now while we build TTPs that may influence that long-term goal of that example of a Mesh 1 capability or a Gateway 1 capability.
I'll suggest that, I think there's a couple different questions on the table, and one is, where does technology meet mission requirements, and how far does that extend, and where does a commercial solution start blurring into augmented or extended kinds of capabilities that more meet military requirements. And I think that one of the questions on the table is, how far does commercial extend into the contested environment? Preston, the on-ramps, and I'm not just saying this because you're on the panel with us, but your on-ramps for ABMS, I think, have been great demonstrations to try to push the envelope on that discussion and take it into some operational realities and think that through. I don't know the answer to that myself. But I think that what it probably requires is continued demonstrations and wargaming. I remember when the first Milstar 2 satellite didn't achieve orbit properly, and that was a big bill to swallow to replace that. And I led the war game that went through to justify why we needed it, what the force implications were, what the trade-offs were to help make the decision on getting that replacement Milstar for the constellation. This probably is as big as buying a Milstar satellite and then some, maybe, when you talk about all the additive pieces of this. But I think that there needs to be some wargaming that really brings partners to the table, and we all sit there and say, will this work technically? Will this work operationally? Will this work in the scenarios that are envisioned?
Yeah, I think ultimately this is this conversation is, do you believe tactics? To me, I see this as, do you believe tactics drive technology, or does technology drive tactics? I tend to see it more as, I like to start with the problem. And so from the problem in the operational test evaluation world, for example, you have a problem, and of course there's limited budgets. So the first thing you do is you go to, can we solve this with a non-material solution, right? And so you look for, can we find a tactical solution to solve this? If not, then we start looking into a technological solution, because that takes money, it takes time, acquisitions process, et cetera. But I think, in our instance, for the conversation today with JADC2, it's absolutely a combination. And I think we have to look at it. And I think you've done that. The LCMC office and the ABMS office have done this, where they've broken this down in the 7 categories. So here's some of the problems that we have today. And then now let's start looking at how we can now solve those with a combination of technology and TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Again, this is where the partnership with industry, I think, comes in. The more we're involved in those conversations, the more we can help with those, at least certainly on the technological side. The TTPs are certainly purely DoD business, but on the technology side, that's where we can come in and help and partner.
Great, thanks. We're going to transition slightly to more rapid fire round, because I've got all kinds of great questions for you all, and we're closing in on time. So probably the last one for each of you, perhaps, and then we'll hit 1 or 2 just to keep the pace going. I get 3 or 4 individuals asking questions related to congressional scrutiny of ABMS and JADC2. That though the budget increased this year, there was a significant reduction relative to the request. Given there appears to be general agreement of the panelists for the need for ABMS and the approach of ABMS to deliver capability over time rather than living for a big bang 7 to 10 years, what can be done to give Congress the confidence that they need? Let's go with some short answers, but address the question.
Yeah, so I'll give you, real quick. I think this is where Simon Sinek kind of nailed it. Always start with the why. I think we need to do a good job of clearly defining for Congress why we need this. To me, this is a third offset strategy, potentially. First one being nuclear weapons, second being stealth technology. I think this is the next way that we gain an asymmetric advantage with a small force that's up against very large peer competitors.
I say a quick win that's not necessarily boiling the ocean, but it's something that's quick, that will actually be impactful, that may be small, but someone can actually take and use in combat or at an exercise that is representative of combat.
I had the same answer, quick wins, and my twist would be take it past the demonstration and the proof point and get it in production.
And I'm a similar mindset. I would say that to get Congress on our side, to get them understanding the need and the necessity of the technologies is there are capabilities out there right now. And there are some emerging mid TRL to high TRL ones that we could put out there in exercises. I would invite Congress to some of those exercises more regularly to have them see some of those demonstrations and those capabilities and start addressing the threat. And how that technology influences that threat in a little bit more effective way.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate the succinctness. We're doing well. We'll get to them. Okay, one question. So with and it kind of dovetails there, Braxton, with your final comment. So with the basic building blocks of ABMS validated through experimentation on-ramps this year, what do you see as sort of the next opportunities that ought to be pursued this year and next year to achieve the JADC2 vision for the Space Force and the Air Force? Perhaps that could serve as your sort of near-term wins to get capabilities in the hands of the warfighter and be understood by those around them. To the panel.
So I'll offer up a quick one. I think getting, our space assets, we have a lot of overhead sensors, getting that information, that data down to the tactical edge in real time. We absolutely can do that, and I believe we should do that.
Exercising the transport layer capabilities that are up in space right now.
Broader participation, get the audiences bigger and get more buy-in and support and advocacy.
I would say putting capabilities on those emerging platforms as a gateway opportunity to start moving data around the battlefield on the forward edge, such as KC-135. I know there's been a little demo on the KC-46 with one of your on-ramps there, Preston, but getting that out so that the warfighters can see it and congressional leaders can see it.
Okay, let's talk about the transition. So each of you kind of alluded to it, other panels here with AFA have, and in fact, there was a whole House Armed Services discussion yesterday on innovation and tech transition. I think we've got some relevant questions on that theme for us today. So now that elements of ABMS have crossed over that valley of death from PowerPoint to experimentation and demonstration to an actual acquisition program, that'll move through those phases of appropriation and fielding. Have you seen, or how has your relationship adjusted with the government and the program executive office overseeing that? And then how do you see that relationship going forward?
I'll jump in here real quick, and as having worked with the Department of the Air Force RCO and its transition to take over some of the fundamental parts of ABMS. I mean, the RCO team has got significant credibility, long heritage and history of wins that produce exquisite capabilities and combat capabilities for our warfighters. I tell you, I'm looking forward to understanding better how their acquisition strategy, I know that's been signed out, but industry still doesn't fully know that, and I believe there's a plan for them to articulate that, and then better understand how the RCO is going to manage and their game plan in coordination with your office, Preston, so that industry can be more informed and make better decisions on where to move their technologies forward and get it out to them and have an opportunity to show them that more effectively.
I think I've maybe answered it in a couple of different other questions in my comments, but it comes back to move fast. Both sides need to take risk. We need to trust each other and get in the room and figure out how to advance the ball and iterate and move forward. We don't have to boil the ocean on day one. We can do enough to get things started. And with that shared risk and trust, move forward together and achieve some successes.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that. Another question here on policy and authorities. So though the approach that is needed for digital modernization and to be able to deliver slices of capability very rapidly is for DevSecOps for hardware and software, which is the approach the department has been on to great effect and really modeled after commercial industry successes. Yet that's not often the way the government approaches acquisition and development. And so it kind of does tie a little bit to the congressional questions earlier. The specific question here on this one is to be able to reinforce the approach that's needed to be able to deliver relevant and agile capabilities over time. Are you, or do you see policy changes or authorization, congressional changes that would be useful to be able to better enable getting capabilities out to the warfighter more quickly?
I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I have an answer for that, Preston, but I think it has to. If in order to stay on the path that you and Dr. Roper and frankly the warfighters, the combatant commanders want, there has to be changes.
I think, it goes back to my comment about opening the door for accepting commercial approaches to doing business and delivering capabilities, terms and conditions, standards, allowing us to embrace the T's and C's that may be equivalent or are equivalent, I think, and sometimes better than the FAR, but allowing us to operate those ways. When you look at OTAs, adjust the rules, traditional versus non-traditional. It seems to me that when you win something, you're all of a sudden traditional, and that kind of closes the door on being non-traditional. So maybe rethink some of that also to allow the innovation and capabilities that may already exist in the wild to be brought in and adapted to the Air Force and Space Force.
I'd piggyback just a little bit on it and say that I think that, as you well know, and over the last 4 years with Dr. Roper in there and Undersecretary Lord in there, I think that articulating what industry needs to do to move faster, as well as while the DoD is revamping or relooking how they do acquisitions, is helpful because industry will be responsive to those changes. If we just go back to the way we were doing business, we're going to go back in industry in the way we're doing business. I think that the pressure needs to be also put on from the DoD side to industry that says gives a clear message that we want to move fast, and industry will be adaptive to that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things in place, but what we're really scratching around here to me is empowering the Department of Defense to go out and work with industry, and so to lift that fear of accidentally saying something and being anyway maybe causing trouble, so there's this very highly protective veil, and I understand that it's trying to protect the system, but I feel like to some extent we can go overboard on that, and so that prevents good, honest, open conversation that would allow us in industry to be able to get the information we need so that we can deliver what the warfighter needs.
Last question here. As you look at maneuvering capabilities into this digital Internet of Things framework, many of you have mentioned the need of that, what we've called the digital trinity: open architecture, standards, DevSecOps software, digital engineering. How do you see moving into that open system world, where open might mean opening to other competitors than your company?
I'll start out and say that there's some misperceptions about, I call us competimates sometimes. There's a lot of industry consortiums and associations that we work very well together. There's a lot of things that we tackle and collaborate on. So tapping into those, I think, helps leverage the broader base of all of us and provides great incubators to get maybe bigger thrusts forward that then we all can compete against when it comes time to actually try to win the business.
Yeah, I would just say, intuitively, the $1 million question, is software is becoming such a big piece of this. How do you deal that from a contract perspective in the government? How do you, recoup investment from the industry side? There's a lot of questions out there, and I certainly wouldn't propose to have those answers, but I would say that it seems to work very smoothly in the commercial world, which tells me that there's a model for us inside of DoD, and maybe that's where we look to that model. But I think ultimately, the internet, of course, there's IP, there's standards, and everybody they build to those standards. So I think once we get to the point where we have that complete, for our military internet things, we have that similar set of standards, then I believe the defense industry will just start developing to those. And so one company will build toaster ovens, and then the other may build refrigerators, but we'll just all build to connect the Lego pieces together there.
And then one will integrate, right? So Preston, I think one of the things that I still find challenging, both inside and outside of uniform, is that we talk about JADC2 and we talk about command and control as a thing, when in reality there's command and there is control, and we can talk about those over beer sometime. But I think the interesting part that we need to continue digging into is how are we going to command and control all domain capabilities? We're developing an architecture. We want to get it done faster, but what is the design? What does it look like when you're commanding and controlling all domain capabilities? And I think once we dig down into that and understand what that end state looks like, then we can up and maybe have a better understanding of how to work with our competitor mates. Over.
Great. Well, thank you for that. With that, we're going to have to close. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for their service, both in personal capacities and professional, to be able to help the Air Force and Space Force not only have tremendous ingredients, but war-winning recipes to be able to achieve JADC2 as a national imperative. And I want to thank our viewers as well for the questions that have guided our conversation today. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Preston. Thanks, team.